So this is day two, the final day of our conference, How Not to Build a Bunker. And today we are starting off with Dr. Audra Mitchell, who will be giving a talk, and Dr. Romy Opperman, sorry, yeah, will be our moderator. So I will give some brief bios of each of the individuals who will be up on stage, and then I'll hand over the stage to the speaker. So our moderator today is Romy, as I mentioned, who's currently an assistant professor of philosophy at the New School, which is where we are right now. Romy's research foregrounds the importance of racism, colonialism, imperialism for environmental and climate justice, and focuses on feminist Africana and anti-colonial philosophy to envision liberated climate futures. Romy is currently working on feminist alternatives to nuclearism and writing a book tentatively titled Groundings, Black Ecologies of Freedom, which sounds super interesting. Our speaker is Audra Mitchell, to my left here, who holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Political Ecology at the Balsillie, am I saying that right? Balsillie? Balsillie. Yes, okay. The Balsillie School for International Affairs and the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. Their scholarship is highly interdisciplinary and spans fields like international studies, global environmental studies, geography, security studies, and the environmental humanities. Their recent work engages diverse systems of indigenous, anti-colonial, and anti-oppressive knowledge in hopes of reframing the way we understand and respond to the mass extinction event that our collective actions have precipitated. Dr. Mitchell has published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles and recently led a partnership that supported community and land-based research projects in 19 indigenous communities across the US, Australia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Canada. Their work currently focuses on multiplying alternatives to human extinction narratives by foregrounding marginalized political traditions and knowledge systems. On a personal note, as I'll mention again later on during my talk, Dr. Mitchell's work has had a significant influence on my own thinking about the flaws and dangers of techno-utopian approaches to imagining our collective future, which underlines most of the work on so-called existential risks these days. So without further ado, I will hand the stage over to Dr. Audra Mitchell, and yes, enjoy.
Can everybody hear me now? Okay, I can hear myself, so that's a good thing. Thank you so much, Emil, and thank you so much to Alice and Emil and all of the organizers for inviting me to join you today at this fascinating symposium. So my name is Audra Mitchell. I'm a white person with shoulder-length hair and blue eyes, seated at a desk with a black tablecloth over it, wearing a navy blue jacket and a white top. And I'm really grateful to have the privilege to be present here today on the traditional lands of the Lenape people and conscious of the obligations that come along with this, including to work against the structural violence that enables my presence here and towards the collective survival of diverse communities, non-humans, and ecosystems. I also want to take a moment to honor the people who are practicing collective survival in the face of genocides in Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere right now, to hold close what they teach us about the ends of worlds, the forms of violence that bring them about, and the many ways of keeping each other lovingly alive in the midst of them. So, in the early 2010s, my partner worked as a tour guide in a nuclear war bunker in a suburban meadow just outside of York in northern England. Half sunk into a suburban lawn, this bunker looked more like a neglected electricity substation than a state-of-the-art nuclear nerve center, as they called them at the time. But the interior was a resplendent fantasy of subtle mid-century techno-aesthetics with ochre walls and rows of swivel chairs, teal floors and wall-sized dark blue maps. It was kind of as if Wes Anderson had designed a set for a Cold War-themed film. Now, starting in the early 1960s, a group of volunteers from the Royal Observer Corps met weekly in the bunker to carry out simulations of nuclear attacks on the UK. Now, this bunker was designed to house 60 people for a 30-day period, at which point the water supply would run out, and they'd all be expected to quietly and very Britishly die. The bunker's amenities were predictably Spartan. It contained air filtration and sewage treatment systems, a kitchen and a canteen, bunk bed dormitories, and a control room that held communication equipment, explosion and radiation detectors, and an automatic weapons detection and recognition, or Audrey, supercomputer. They all called her Audrey. They were all very kind of fond of this early supercomputer. And her job was to automatically detect nuclear explosions and estimate their size in megatons. So this bunker was intended to coordinate data that would be sent in from a whole network of about 40 subterranean mini bunkers around the Yorkshire countryside. These were tiny ones that only held about 3 people. And they'd relay this data to higher authorities, such as the Ministry of Defense. And the goal, or at least the stated goal, was to help them find parts of the country that were a little bit safer than the others. Now, this bunker was not designed to sustain it or withstand a direct hit. The volunteers who entered it did so, not with the hope of protecting themselves or their families and loved ones, whom they agreed to leave to their fates above ground. The curators and historians who now frequent the bunker, which became an English heritage tourist site in the 1990s, often tell visitors that actually its main role was not to save Britons from nuclear war or anyone else, but rather to make the public less panicked and, of course, more governable. So today, the bunkers, armored homes, private cities, and space colonies being planned and constructed by billionaires, the super wealthy, and as we'll talk about, even the just wealthy enough, couldn't be more different in their aesthetics, their facilities, and their purpose, even though some of them were quite literally built in the vacated shells of Cold War subterranean architecture, and a lot of it adopts some of its principles and plans. Now, unlike the York bunker, these shelters are designed expressly to ensure the survival of those who enter them for as long as possible. And as Douglas Rushkoff's work shows, these are often lavish, aspirational dream bunkers, or at least their builders intend them to be. These bunkers are designed not only to meet the needs and wishes of their would-be denizens, but also to reflect their wealth, power, and importance in the world, or at least as they interpret it. They reframe post-apocalyptic survival as luxury in both senses of the term, that those worthy of survival, those who manage to stick around through whatever happens, ought to live in luxury, and that survival itself is a luxury that is not to be expected by anybody but the wealthy or those with access to this kind of privilege. So the primary goal of these bunkers is not only to hoard survival chances and resources, but also to protect, by force if necessary, the privileged from their most feared threat, other people who aren't content to stoically perish. So bunkers tell us a lot, I think, about who gets to survive, but also who gets to decide who gets to survive. Each of these very different bunkers is a material reflection of collective existential angst focused on very different predictions of world-ending events, and also of very different ideas about what it means to keep humanity extant or from going extinct. While Cold War bunkers were concerned primarily with the survival of the state and the state system, the bunkers of the wealthy reflect wider political commitments and ambitions. I won't go too deeply into these frameworks here, as Douglas already went into them last night, and I know my fellow presenters will discuss them in more depth. But I do want to say a few words about a couple of strands of thought. So, of course, one is the bundle of ideas, strategies, and manifestos that fall under the umbrella of what Emile and Timnit Gebru have termed the TESCREAL bundle. We've already talked a fair amount about that. And these include transhumanist dreams of enhancing humanity. As I'll discuss shortly, these frameworks essentially leverage catastrophic events as bottlenecks, all of this in, what do you call these, air bunnies, for separating out the genetic chaff, or what these particular people think of as the genetic chaff, in order to produce the conditions for the emergence of superior posthumans, and potentially to put an end to pesky problems such as entropy and embodiment. Now, in so doing, transhumanist discourses reduce all bodies, even those they value the most, essentially to carriers of traits and potential that can be leveraged to produce more highly valued human beings. And we'll come back to this a little bit later, this notion of value and how it has become conflated with this idea of higher or superior, because the two things, I think, are very entwined. So this logic works similarly to many mainstream discourses of biodiversity that fetishize evolution and its potential as goods in themselves, to the extent that actual beings are reduced to mere meat or cellulose sacks of genetic materials. Another element that test realists have in common with this particular strand of conservation is this obsession with limitless potential and unidirectional improvement. From this perspective, if time is a one-directional process and progress itself is unlimited, then it seems a short step for these folks to declare that future humans not only have ethical claims, and a great many of them, according to calculations of the quantity of possible future humans. And this is one of the things that always, catches my attention about the EAs and so forth, is that they equate the number of people with the number of claims, and the number of claims with the importance of these claims, right? This is taking quantification to quite an extreme. Anyway, so there's also the implication that these claims may actually weigh heavier than those of the inferior beings who have the audacity to exist right now, because they're simply better beings. So this is how Nick Bostrom, and Emil knows, I'll never shut up about this guy, could infamously claim that protecting the potential of the emergence of transhumans is worth at least 100 times the value of 1 million existing human lives. Now, to my knowledge, he's never actually recanted that, has he? No. A few other things he's recanted, but we won't go into that right now. Anyway, according to test realists, these speculative lives are simply worth more than actually existing ones. And that's how speculation works, isn't it? Within capitalism, the things that we speculate on, invest on in the future are simply more valuable than those that exist. So this is also very similar. It's the exact same mechanism through which regimes of racialized imperialism, ableism, colonization, and eugenics declare some co-temporal lives more valuable than others. It's just that this is translated into a spatial and temporal register. So meanwhile, the notions of long-termism, effective altruism, and rationalism all share a deep commitment to what they regard as the optimization of humanity's future conditions and characteristics. They rely on a horrifying form of global arbitrage in which the rational allocation of survival chances, resources, and care rests entirely on existing, but unacknowledged, and this is the thing, they will not acknowledge this, systems of colonial, imperial, capitalist, racist, and ableist global power that have artificially cheapened and conveniently pre-stratified certain lives, ecological and social systems, marking them as damaged or degraded, and handily priming them for reinvestment through charity or the much more aspirational philanthropy, in a process that we might call eugentrification, because if you see, this is exactly the same logic that's being used here. Cheapen something, damage something, invest, invest, invest. Okay, so at the same time as Alice and her colleagues have brilliantly shown, EA and related strategies have flooded existing movement spaces in ways that leverage the colonial capitalist strategy of systematically breaking down existing relational structures in order to replace them with their own models. However, these aren't the only forms of apocalyptic thinking that are driving the current trend to literal or metaphorical bunker building. As Kelly Hayes has recently argued, these ways of thinking have never been fully separate from Christian fundamentalist discourses and political formations, in which techno-utopian ambitions blend with evangelical beliefs and millenarian desires, converging, for instance, in the disturbing trend towards pronatalism, in which white supremacists attempt to make as many of each other as possible. Now, there's another strand of contemporary doom-forward thinking that I want to highlight because I think it often flies under the radar. I call it neoliberalism, and it's a potent blend of eco-political pessimism and liberal humanitarianism. It's usually expressed by people invested, at least in principle, in areas such as mainstream environmentalism, human rights, and development. Neoliberals espouse the universal model of humanity that emerged in the period of intense international norm building in the 1990s and early 2000s, not least because of its elegant and very handy abstraction. Now, neoliberals are concerned about the future of this model of humanity, which they define primarily in terms of their own children and people like them, and secondarily in terms of prescribed categories of people who they may help to save if resources permit. After all, there's nothing quite like a global apocalypse, to remind us to put our families first. So you'll find neoliberals at dinner parties and book launches nodding very seriously and commiserating about the fact that everyone's fucked, while not quite believing deep down that everyone actually includes them. That's the other humanity, right? So this is why, in their many best-selling books and think pieces, they play quite unsubtly and unself-critically on an apparent irony or a shocking narrative twist that we, too, might actually be affected by all of this. Now, one of their stylistic tells is that they explicitly address readers who have not, for instance, experienced environmental racism or mass displacement. And they write about people who have, as if they couldn't possibly be in the room or reading the book. It's not just, as Amitov Ghosh's recent works have shown, these folks construct elaborate collective fantasies of business as usual as hurricanes lash at their walls. In fact, maybe we could call them denial liberals. It's also a matter of the subjectivity they embody. Writers in the genre invariably cast themselves in the role of dispassionate, edgy, generically caring but distanced observers, and thus as presumed future survivors who will bear the heavy burden of rebuilding all of this, in an improved form, of course, after the proverbial dust has settled. Now, there are many strands of neoliberalism, so I'll give just a few examples. They include blithe predictions by esteemed climate scientists and historians of the elimination of entire peoples in other parts of the world, and preparations to manage the conflict arising from what they regard as inevitable competition over resources. And we'll come back at the end to, and I think, Douglas mentioned this last night too, this is not actually borne out by the data of what happens when people are under extreme duress, as we're seeing in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan right now. So we'll come back to that. But all of this is bolstered by lurid imagery of racialized migrants overrunning borders and food stocks alike. And again, this isn't coming from that former and hopefully never again president, but rather from respected center-left academics. Or we have statements such as one from a well-regarded science journalist that he would pretty much be okay with most other species going extinct, as long as his and his own daughter's way of life can mostly continue as it is, right? And this sentiment is twinned by performative rituals of mourning that we see in many settler colonial countries by mostly white people for charismatic megafauna. Megafauna, that's a horrible idea. Oh my God. It's probably, I'm sure there's a billionaire out there trying, maybe Douglas knows, I don't know, trying to create charismatic megafauna. I guess that's what Trump is. Anyway. Within these narratives of mourning, usually the only relationship is one of colonial claims to ownership and nostalgia for childhood stories that affirm that claim. So we also see neoliberalism, the wildly popular folk panic surrounding the horror that middle-class children in the US, Canada, and places like this might become disabled as a result of climate change, including exposure to toxins, microbes, or trauma, just like those poor kids they've seen on the news. And we'll come back to this towards the end of the talk as well. Another example of neoliberalism is found in the many books offering instructions of how to take advantage of or capitalize on crises by leveraging the upside of the collapse of ecological, political, and social systems to build better and more resilient liberal democracies run by hypothetical rugged white men named John and maybe a few women, because there are only two genders. On the blurb of one best-selling book by another regarded science journalist, frames it as a matter of common sense that disabled and/or poor people will obviously continue to be culled by heat events in the coming years. What else would we do, right? Still another example is found in the popular proposal of a well-known conservationist to annex more than half of the Earth's surface, or exactly half to be precise. And what's interesting, this is E.O. Wilson's half-Earth proposal I'm talking about, and he openly admits that this number is not based on science. It's based on this moonshot, X Prize philosophy that, again, Douglas was talking about last night. It's supposed to motivate people to put themselves in the shoes of these billionaire megalomaniacs. Okay, and one of the important things about that proposal is that it demands the removal of human activity, right? This idea that there are no people there shouldn't be people there. They're getting in the way of our plans for how we want the Earth to be. So these are just some of many examples of neoliberalism. And the point is that because it's very mainstream, it doesn't often register as extreme. And yet it fosters alarming views that aren't very far from those of test realists, albeit on different scales and with quite smaller budgets. So as we'll see, neoliberals are building their own bunkers, not least by hoarding access to public goods, influence, and social capital. So these various practices of bunker building tell us what to expect in the future and how to respond, how to relate to one another, what, if anything at all, that we owe each other, and how to act when we're all differently under extreme threat. They also point to the fallibility, though, of their designers' predictions and plans. The York bunker, whose inadequacies in the face of actual nuclear war may now seem laughable or cryable, is actually material testimony to the fact that the expected future doesn't always come to pass, despite the certainties and the rehearsals of those anticipating it. This actually undermines one of the key claims of bunker builders of all sorts. It shows us that there isn't one end to one world, but rather many ends to many worlds. And even if the event does happen, there are many, many different ways of understanding it and responding to it. And the event is probably already happening and has already happened, right? So there's many, many ends of worlds. And for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about two traditions that hold open other worlds, other endings, and most importantly, maybe, other ways of comporting ourselves towards them. And those traditions are abolition and disability justice. So many of us may already be familiar with these frameworks, but since they do tend to be bracketed out pretty much completely in discussions of global crises, I'll give a brief and deeply incomplete, of course, intro to them. So abolition is a diverse multinational movement with deep roots in the opposition to global chattel slavery and its many afterlives, including but not limited to the interwoven carceral, penal, and disciplinary structures that disproportionately target Black, racialized, Indigenous, disabled, queer, and or poor people. And as key thinkers such as Angela Y. Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore have argued, are integral to the functioning logics and power of contemporary states and contemporary corporations, which of course are taking on much larger roles in global governance. Growing from these roots, contemporary abolitionist thought, identifies the functions, sources of power, and forms of violence wielded by these structures, for instance, by highlighting the links between racism, capital accumulation, and speculation, the dispossession of Indigenous people, unfree labor, and constantly expanding and elaborating bordering regimes. In addition, scholars like Rua Benjamin, Joy Bulamwini, and Timney Gebru have shown how racist, carceral, and surveillance structures underpin also the digital environments and social structures that are continually shaping our lives and becoming the medium in which we're forced to live our lives. However, abolition isn't just about identifying the harmful structures that, to paraphrase Gilmore, radically unequally distribute harm and death. It's also about creating alternative systems of justice and collective care that meet diverse needs without recourse to formalized violence and punishment. In other words, creating a better option. For instance, contemporary abolitionist frameworks often respond to severe threats that are focused on collective survival of humans and non-humans, emphasizing aspects such as mutual aid and transformative justice, and the creation of community accountability structures to address and prevent violence, harm, and prevention, right? So this is about saying, not only are there other ways of doing this, not only has this been done in different ways many, many times by many, many different societies, but we need to imagine and constantly, I would say, be as creative in elaborating these alternatives as the billionaires are, maybe be more creative than they are, right? Okay, so disability justice emerged in the early 2000s from the efforts of racialized and queer disabled activists, organizers, and knowledge makers who were disillusioned with the whiteness and straightness of dominant disability rights frameworks, which were largely coming out of Britain and the US at that time, and the way that these had been co-opted into neoliberal institutions or were never really separate from them in the first place. So rather than focusing primarily on issues of access for those formally documented as disabled, disability justice confronts the issue of ableism, which key movement thinker T.L. Lewis describes as a form of systematic oppression that, and I quote, assigns values to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness, deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And that's the end of the quote. And it does this by weaponizing norms of health, wellness, fitness, good behavior, productivity, and reproduction. Now, crucially, as Lewis and many others point out, you don't have to be disabled or identify as such to experience ableism. It structures and underpins myriad social norms regarding conduct, appearance, work, social belonging, political agency, ecological relations, and so much more. Now, importantly, DJ movements, I'm going to call it DJ from now on, involve a critique of the pathologizing nature of many medical discourses and their diffusion through other social structures. For this reason, they attend not only to forms of disability that are legible to states and to other actors, but also include so-called invisible disabilities, chronic illness, pain and fatigue, environmental and chemical injury and illness, which some of you will know is almost routinely denied by most of the medical system, epidemics and pandemics, reproduction and social justice, addiction, harm reduction, and crucially, collective trauma, including the effects of racism, ableism, colonization, anti-queerness, and more. In a related sense, Jasbir Pure's theory of debilitation draws attention to how structural forms of violence wear down, break, wound, maim, and inflict suffering on bodies in ways that are never acknowledged or granted formal rights as disability, making these bodies permanently available for extraction, exploitation, and the perpetuation of power. And again, she's working primarily in the context of the Palestinian people and Israel's claims to be using humane shoot to maim rather than shoot to kill policies. So I contend that these frameworks actually offer much better bases for analyzing and responding to the converging threats of the present and future than those of the bunker builders for a whole host of reasons. First, they address and transform the root causes of the threats in question, directly confronting what I call, and please forgive the acronym, it's just too many words sometimes, the crash plus formation, which is colonialism, racism, ableism, anthropocentrism, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, eugenics, and all of their various alloys, which come together in unique ways in each context that they foist themselves upon. And together they fueled and sustained global power grabbing and consolidation for more than 500 years. In contrast, the bunker building approaches so far seek to reinvest in or supercharge crash plus structures. And this is part of, again, I think in Douglas's talk last night came through for me. These guys aren't really doing anything new. They always package it as new. They always say, oh, it's a big leap forward. Really, they're taking pretty well-entrenched crash plus formations and thinking about how they can squeeze that bit more value out of them. So I think that the critique that DJ and abolition give of those root causes is very important here. Second, most TESCREAL and neoliberal approaches evaluate threats by relying almost entirely on abstract modeling, speculation, again, a different kind of speculation this time, and high-risk experimental interventions like geoengineering that involve significant levels of risk for most of those they would affect. In contrast, DJ and abolitionist approaches draw on centuries of lived knowledge of actually surviving threats to collective survival, using concrete evidence and experience to formulate their principles, strategies, and analyses. And if you ever want to get into a fun argument with a TESCREAList, talk to them about evidence, right? Like, but we have models. I'm like, I can make a model. These folks have evidence. Anyway. So third, as mentioned, most human extinction narratives draw from a single, extremely limited set of knowledge strategies and epistemes, those of which are rooted in Eurocentric and all of the other constraints placed by colonial and imperialist thinking. Meanwhile, abolition and DJ weave together insights from multiple knowledge systems and traditions across diverse contexts and temporalities. So this multiplies the sources of knowledge, perspectives, theories, and data that they're drawing from, and that's available for analyzing present threats and nurturing different kinds of futures. So fourth, where mainstream human extinction narratives often struggle to formulate adequate ethical frameworks or as mere add-ons or afterthoughts, or this is another fun thing to talk to them about, they always think there's one ethics, there's one moral philosophy, and if you don't espouse that, then you probably haven't studied it, right? So anyway, there's these real problems with developing ethics around this. Whereas DJ and abolition practices are essentially ethical practices. These are embedded in their relational models, things like conflict resolution to relationship mapping to ecological knowledge, right? So this ethics isn't an afterthought, it's most of the thing, if not the whole thing. So fifth, and crucially, where mainstream responses to threats of human extinction are dominated by the priorities of the groups least vulnerable to the relevant crises and harms, abolitionist and DJ movements are led by the groups most directly and severely affected, and actually the most vulnerable, or the most knowledgeable rather, of how to navigate, resist, and survive them. Although it can't be emphasized enough that they don't exist to be plumbed or extracted from in order to prop up existing systems. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I think this is really important. Whenever I talk about this in groups where there are, test realists around or neoliberals, they'll say, okay, well, how can we take this traditional knowledge and instrumentalize it so we can survive? I'm like, dude, we might not survive. Be okay with that, especially if dude is, like myself, a white person. We can't presume that we're necessarily going to be at the center of all of this. And I think this is something, I'll come back to Kyle Powis' white work at the end, but one of the things that in my conversations with him has always stuck with me is this idea of being okay with wanting a future that you might not be a part of, right? It's okay to want a future that you're not a part of, but not for the test realists. Okay, sixth, approaches focused on preventing human extinction often bracket off other life forms and ecosystems. I think the clue is in the name. They're thinking about humans and post-humans and transhumans as if they live in a vacuum with no relations to other beings. Meanwhile, DJ and abolitionist practices promote notions of survival, flourishing, and liberation as ecosystemic qualities, right? These don't make sense outside of ecosystems. And they embrace explicitly ecological models and principles as sources for social order and action. Now, I'm generalizing. Not every single one of them does, but I think this is a very strong strand within these movements. And this is pretty important when you want to dwell with other beings as part of ecosystems, which really isn't a priority for test realists and quite a few neoliberals. Actually, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to go to the Whitney recently. They have an exhibit on the top floor, which is I think it's called Survival Piece. And these two academics, I'm not sure what field they were in the 70s, created this what they call a portable orchard. And it's orange trees basically in some pots in a room. Right now I was walking around this and they're saying, oh, this is a future. We can sustain these things when all the rest of the orchards are gone. And I'm thinking, okay, this is 10 pots in a room. And 5 of them are dead. So, right? I mean, this is the lack of ecosystemic thinking we're seeing amongst these folks. And those are neoliberals. Those aren't even test realists. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about all right? Okay. So now I'd like to talk about 4 key insights that DJ and abolitionist thought offer into the nature of apocalyptic discourses. The first relates to the strategies of abandonment and rationing, which are key to the bunker builder's guide to the apocalypse. So abandonment, and more specifically structural abandonment, is a term developed by Gilmore and elaborated by other abolitionist thinkers to describe the deliberate, strategic, multi-scale withdrawal or denial of support, resources, labor, energy, and other life-sustaining goods from marginalized communities deliberately in order to disempower and undermine these communities. And this goes along with permissiveness towards the collapse of life-sustaining structures, including social and ecological systems, in ways that support and enhance existing formations of power. So examples range from the government-condoned deterioration of health services in rural communities to the global-scale hoarding of COVID vaccines, to state and corporate complicity in global deforestation, soil and water degradation. I would add that abandonment works hand in hand with the systematic targeting for destruction that I mentioned before of eco-political relationships, this hallmark of crash plus formation and its modes of worlding, to get in there, destroy what exists, and replace it with its own models, this kind of very parasitic approach to worlding. At the foundation of it, this is what bunker builders are doing, not only literally abandoning others or planning to, fantasizing about abandoning others to their fate in a material sense, and of course withdrawing or withholding resources. And this is often banal. It could be their withholding of tax, fair pay, the wage theft that they carry out, or the lack of social contributions they make, but also actively accelerating ongoing process of abandonment in order to make room for their projects. For instance, through the capture of public resources by neoliberals, for instance, through the, what Gilmore and others have called the NGO industrial complex, right, where NGOs are becoming something that's actually taking away from social activism and the meeting of needs. Now, space colonization fantasies are perhaps the most explicit example of this logic because they're literally scheduling the entire planet for abandonment, right? They're literally saying, let's draw all of our resources, anything that we have to offer away from this, let it die so we can go off and build something more valuable elsewhere. Now, the closely related concept of rationing involves the restriction of access to the means of survival in conditions of real or predicted crisis. And this is carried out according to principles that are deemed to be rational and optimal, according to the frameworks of those who are making the decisions. Now, importantly, rationing is often weaponized as a means of influencing future outcomes, right? So it's often framed, whether we're talking about traditional war context or this kind of new emerging concept of rationing is, well, we have to do this. We have to do this in order to survive. But if you look at these human extinction discourses, no, it's not in order to survive. It's in order to make sure that the people that we want to survive, or the other life forms that we want to survive. And as abolitionists show, that is rationing. That has always been rationing. That's the logic at the core of it. So a helpful guide to this logic is found in DJ thinker Leah Lakshmi Samarazinya's notion of care rationing, which describes the processes through which racialized and or disabled and or queer people were and continue to be systematically denied care throughout the pandemic on the basis that A, they were going to die anyway. Not true, but we'll come back to that. B, that they didn't make for optimal investments of scarce goods. And again, this is not Elon Musk saying this. This is healthcare workers who have been trained to make this kind of judgment in their face-to-face interactions with other people. And C, that the dominant society didn't really want them in the shared future anyway. As critical disability studies scholar Alison Kafer argues, many normative visions of the future, including most neoliberal and many progressive ones, identify their desired futures in opposition to the presence of disabled people. We're a popular foil. You want a good future? Imagine it without people like me in it, okay? So, dominant discourses surrounding human extinction involve a scaling up of this logic to a global form that we might call survival rationing. Building on Gilmore's analysis of the global distribution of early deaths along racial lines, and that's always a kind of complicated concept, but she's talking about deaths that would not otherwise have happened without the racial and other violent processes that are in place to ensure their distribution in these patterns, right? And as we'll discuss in a moment, rationing and abandonment are indispensable to the eugenicist projects embraced by many tech realists and neoliberals. They rapidly expedite the winnowing of the genetic pool that these projects require without demanding the dirty work of direct physical violence. In a sickening inversion of genocide, they dream of isolating these human genes with the best potential and getting rid of the bad genes. Emil, you remember that conversation with the eugenicists? The bad genes? They only wanted to get rid of the bad genes. They wanted to keep all the good ones. Anyway, and they want to do this by enabling and accelerating the destruction of pretty much everyone else. So another key concept from abolitionist thought is carcerality, or the complex body of practices, networks of power, modes of violence, and logics of control that co-constitute power within modern states and corporations. Carcerality includes policing in all of its forms, not only the actions of formalized police forces, but also of private security forces, mercenaries, vigilantes, the mostly white citizens who deputize ourselves to monitor and report the actions of racialized others, along with social structures such as prisons, jails, schools, hospitals, psychiatric institutions, social welfare programs, and universities, to whom numerous policing, surveilling, and disciplinary roles are increasingly delegated. It also includes norms of criminality that map onto deep-seated ideas of threat and security. And this is often, something that's talked about by criminologists, not often by people who study international and global theory, but I would argue that we see the same things in a kind of nested fractal way at all of these different scales of analysis. So for instance, the violence targeted on Black, Indigenous, disabled, mad, and or queer people in places like the US and Canada are reflected in the neoliberal images discussed above, which predict racialized bodies seething across borders, monstrously devouring everything in their wake. Now, as disability justice Mel Y. Chen and others point out, images of zombies and other supernatural threats that shape public discourses on apocalypse through first-person shooter games, blockbuster films, and other cultural artifacts feature barely disguised avatars of disabled, racialized, and/or queer people, marked by established indicators of otherness, such as unnatural movements, insatiable appetite, and injured, modified, or missing body parts. So as Chen argues, popular culture not only tolerates, but actively celebrates, simulates, and rehearses the destruction of these bodies, right? By justifying brutal violence with the self-righteous goal of protecting normative humanity. Okay, and I'm gonna just say, I am anti-video game. I get attacked for this everywhere I go, but I've tried very hard. I cannot be okay with people spending enormous amounts of their time learning and training themselves to kill bodies that are non-normative. Just gonna say it. Okay, so as Chen and others point out, these same markers, these strange movements, this bodily difference, are routinely given as justifications for police and military killings today. But these are also the bodies that bunker builders dread encountering at the gates of their compounds. And it's in this context that the bunker builders frame the entire planet as a prison, turning the inside of their secured spaces into the locus of safety, survival, and these treasured liberal forms of freedom, and the outside into a place of relentless exposure and violence, along with intense, diverse, and widely diffused forms of policing that are constantly morphing into new forms. So this is the logic of the ultra-wealthy people described in Douglas's book, who are anxious to hire and train mercenaries who won't turn on them, as you discussed last night, but also of liberal democratic states using borders, literally and figuratively, as prison courtyards, or of middle-class communities creating formal and informal gates around themselves. So DJ and abolitionist thinkers also turn our attention towards logics of elimination and eugenics. Elimination describes the direct and or indirect destruction of groups that are deemed undesirable and or threatening by normative members of a community. And I want to really underscore this. Humanity, when we're talking about humanity, this is a very narrow, normatively defined idea of humanity. Again, I mentioned the focus on the ideas from the 1990s, which many of us hold dear, and for good reason. These are the basis of things like human rights and a lot of social justice activism. But these are very narrow notions of what humanity is, has been, and could be. So, elimination is realized in multiple forms, including but not limited to genocide, forced sterilization, and the targeted destruction of ecosystems. And it's sustained through cultural strategies, social norms, aesthetics, legal precedents, and many other forces. So eugenics, of course, is the idea that in order to protect the quality of humanity, and indeed to have a chance at enhancing it, it's necessary to control the transmission of those bad genes, which is negative eugenics, or the idea of negative eugenics, and or to promote the passing on of the desirable ones, or so-called positive eugenics. Now, this is most often associated with late 19th century thought and assumed to have peaked during the Nazi regime. And like many ongoing colonial genocides, people tend to relegate eugenics to the past. In fact, and to treat it as largely a fringe phenomenon. But as Rua Benjamin and others have really, forcefully argued, eugenics was a mainstream policy well into the 20th century, but it never really went away. Instead, it's morphed into new forms. So these include things like medical studies of the blood cells of Indigenous and Black people, often without any kind of consent, in order to benefit white communities, to multi-million-dollar studies to identify and excise the genes that are thought to cause autism, all of which are bound up within highly lucrative cycles of state and private funding, including increasingly venture capital. DJ and abolitionist perspectives show us how the bunker and its logics work as instruments of eugenics by strategically safeguarding the bodies they view as the ideal carriers of future posthumans or transhumans. And in the case of pronatalists, encouraging the proliferation of only these bodies while leveraging the expected destruction of most of the rest of the gene pool, because that's what we are, right? We're a gene pool, in order to facilitate a redo of humanity. So racialized, gendered, and ableist hierarchies are key to this dream. For instance, the only Black and Indigenous people who get to survive in this scenario are instrumentalized, whether as guards to keep the attackers at bay, or, as America's creepiest economist Robin Hanson once wrote, to be enslaved as stocks of knowledge. And not my words; I think those are his words. Anyway, Slate Magazine. Okay, and I say this because he called me a pig once, but that's all right. We won't talk about him too much. Anyway, so Robin Hanson once wrote, and he said this was done in the most, respectful and sensitive way, that these folks should be enslaved as stocks of knowledge and labor for the use of self-designated survivors so that they could create their new, humanity by, I guess, forcing people to breed. He wasn't too clear on how that would work. Anyway, so those who want to build bunkers of any kind aren't just concerned with surviving as individuals or even of their family's survival, but rather with ensuring that it's their lineage, their genes, their technologies, their norms, and the dreams that they that inhabit and inherit the future, right? And I mean, it must be fun to be the child of one of these billionaires. Like, you are my lineage. You are not a human. You are some genes I've created. But that's really what they're talking about here. And this is nothing new. It's the extension of colonial capitalist impulses to claim territory and temporality for one's bloodline and with one's, what we would now think of as genes. And it's yet another form of capital accumulation. Bunker builders are literally stocking genes and potential in a manner similar to that of the many seed and gene banks that have already been created to repopulate Earth's ecosystems in the context of mass extinction, but also to bring these life forms into the ownerships of states, universities, and private corporations, literally commodifying the basis of life. And again, there are these, billionaires who want to de-extinct mammoths and such, but this is much more mainstream. This is going on within probably, well, maybe not this university, but most major universities are involved in work of this kind. So very, very mainstream. So crucially, each in their own ways, test realists and neoliberals are investing in the capital project of improving humanity, which isn't new either. As critical disability scholar Anne Maguire has argued, one of the key functions of ableism in neoliberal cultures is to spur investment in the normalization of children in order to maximize their potential productivity in financial and social terms. So this logic relates directly to another troubling element of apocalyptic thinking, which is, as I mentioned before, the dread of becoming disabled or becoming more disabled. This is an extremely common fear found, for instance, in statistics that link reduced cognitive performance, read intelligence, to increasing average temperatures, or that chastise racialized disabled people for vaccine hesitancy without accounting for the histories of eugenicist abuse and the ongoing eugenicist abuse in these communities. So for many of the apocalyptically minded, even the most non-disabled of currently existing humans will automatically become disabled in relation to their changing environments, the transhumans or higher intelligences they anticipate emerging, or both. For instance, for many transhumanists, simply having a body will become a disability or impairment compared to the happiness of digital existence. Now, I realize that they're drawing on utilitarian notions of happiness, but it, again, strikes me as so discordant that they always talk about being happy in this digital world. Okay, so most of the time, the argument actually stops here because within ableist societies like ours, it's generally assumed that it's bad and dangerous to be disabled. So even in Douglas's talk last night, he mentioned that some of the billionaires are saying, oh, but this will stop cerebral palsy. And everyone's like, oh, okay, that's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Why do we not want people with cerebral palsy? We need all of us in this world. Anyway, the sources of the folk panic are quite complicated, and in order to discuss that, I want to finally get round to AI, which I guess is kind of what we're here to talk about in some ways. So in the many talks and articles on AI that I've taken in the last couple of years, I hear two ideas repeated over and over. First, that AIs are going to be smarter than us. And when you ask them, what do you mean by smarter? They usually mean quicker, able to process more data, better at decision-making, more detail-oriented, etc. And second, that this superior intelligence is a threat to us. So these ideas reflect a particular crush plus amalgam that I call neurosupremacy. This is the belief that there's one standard form of sentience against which all others, human and non-human, can and ought to be evaluated, disciplined, and ranked. Neurosupremacy is deeply entrenched in the European philosophical tradition, going at least as far back as Aristotle, and particularly within the British liberal thinkers that became the foundation of many of our contemporary nation states. But until the last century or so, it's been largely concerned with ranking and ordering that bit of the spectrum below the rank of man, and capital M in Sylvia Wynter's sense of the term, this normative notion of man, within neurosupremacist frameworks. Forms of cognition, sensory experience, bodily comportment, communication, many other elements are framed as deviant but also as threatening to the extent that they diverge from established and enforced norms. This is that zombie image that I was discussing before. So this is the source of many pathologized notions of neurological disorder and mental illness and their widespread criminalization, which of course is, again, not based on evidence. What's been interesting to me as an autistic and multiply disabled form of sentience is hearing AIs described in stereotypes that are commonly deployed against my community. For instance, they're often called cold, emotionless, unempathetic, calculating, not capable of understanding nuance, unnatural, lacking imagination, or mechanical in the way they think. And more to the point, the assumption that these perceived traits add up to potentially murderous indifference, or at least malice towards normative humanity. These fears rely on the uncritical embrace of hierarchies of mind that assume that intelligence is quantifiable, gradable, and can be organized into ranks. And moreover, that these rankings map directly onto degrees of political agency, ethical status, social belonging, and other things that might restrain a being from killing everyone else. Second, these discourses evince terror of suddenly falling from the top rung of the intelligence hierarchy, not just because that would be a bad in itself, but also because many people fear it would lead to their oppression, right? That assumption that the AIs, if they're better than us, if they're more intelligent than us, they will harm us. In fact, in our society, this is an absolutely logical thought. Perceived intelligence is amongst the most prevalent determinants of privilege, exclusion, and oppression, melding with racist and colonial imperatives to produce severe inequalities in the distribution of social goods and harms. Just consider how the terms moron, imbecile, and especially idiot, which were developed specifically for the eugenicist ranking of racialized and disabled immigrants to the US, are used by most of us daily without blinking an eye, reminding many of us, sometimes dozens of times daily, just how contingent our humanity is. Intuiting these conditions, however subconsciously, many people are convinced that they will be enslaved, controlled, or exploited by a superior intelligence. Ironically, these discourses have hit pretty directly on the way that ableism, neurosupremacy, eugenics, and carcerality lie at the heart of apocalyptic politics and the oppressive conditions that they would amplify. So I think they're right in that intuition. Yet, rather than actively fighting to transform those structures, let alone to form ecosystems of sentience and just relations with other beings, they're urging us to double down on ableism and to invest even more deeply in policing, controlling and oppressive social systems, including those neurosupremacist hierarchies. So, abolition and DJ can help us to understand and resist the logics of bunker builders. But I'd like to finish by asking, if not bunkers, what are DJs and abolitionists actually building? Lots of things, it turns out, and I'll give just a couple of examples. One is networks, pods, and maps that help the people made most vulnerable in and by crisis to identify and share resources for survival. One example is DJ thinker Mia Mingus's Care Pod Mapping Project, which helps marginalized people, and everyone really, to identify material sources such as food, shaded places, but also resources such as people that they can trust or they can reciprocally care for. And it really encourages everybody to figure out what they can do rather than what they can't do. It's both about needs and which needs you can meet for others, not in that kind of transactional way, but in a more holistic sense. So for instance, during the early days of the pandemic, disabled folks in the Bay Area organized to source, make, and share protective equipment, food, money, fuel, medical equipment, and much more, eventually scaling this work to national and international levels, because they quite rightly guessed and knew from past experience that the state wasn't going to do it. The state especially wasn't going to do it for the most vulnerable amongst them, such as unhoused and undocumented people. Another example is the Mapping Community Ecosystems of Collective Care project, led by abolitionists Shannon Perez Darby and Andrea J. Ritchie. It works to build and connect existing collective survival structures of all kinds. Some of them are mutual aid networks, some of them are community fridges, some of them are business associations, right? But they also work to connect these groups with groups that are more actively involved in abolitionist practices, such as violence interruption and crisis response teams, in order to ensure the wide sharing of survival chances. Another thing that DJers and abolitionists are building is knowledge. And again, going back to Douglas's opening talk last night, talking about keeping that thread going through the bad times. This is really a key focus of DJ and abolitionist thought. And this is done not least through reclaiming and cross-pollination of ancestral and traditional knowledge systems for survival, healing, and care, but also knowledge of, for instance, how to survive a police raid, how to make sure those with lower mobility aren't left alone in a hurricane, how to respond to intra-community violence while in the middle of a crisis, and how to work as part of ecosystems to ensure ongoing access to food and medicines, not just for humans. Another thing these movements are building is relationships and solidarity in strategic and multi-scale ways. For instance, by identifying shared horizons of harm and knowledge of how to resist and survive it across communities, borders, and internationally. And that project that Emile had mentioned in his introduction to me, or their introduction to me, sorry, is really about groups, indigenous groups that face very different forms and histories of colonization, figuring out how to share knowledge of how to survive it. So that's one example. They're also building safe houses, networks, and communities for undocumented, displaced, and violenced people, and experimental improvisational communities. So Ritchie points to the importance of these experimental communities in helping people work out their needs and those of others, not because it's not a crisis right now, but because the crisis will always change, and the more we can know about our needs and those of others, the better. So this is about repeatedly rehearsing and refining practices of collaborative survival. And in many ways, these are the opposite of the simulations used by apocalyptic preppers, whether the volunteers in the York bunker or the billionaires figuring out how to keep poor people out of their private caches. DJ and abolitionist organizers aren't waiting for a future event. They're building these communities now, and have been doing so for hundreds of years in some cases, in order to survive the ongoing apocalypse of the Crash Plus formation. And even if these experiments don't ultimately save humanity, they aim, as Kyle White puts it, to get relationships right with Earth and with each other right now. And so whatever happens, I'd rather live in the futures and presents that they're constructing than in the most lavish billionaire's bunker. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can just shift a little bit and get cozy. Fun.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad we get to be in conversation. So I'm just going to ask a few questions and then we'll open it up for everyone else. So please note your carefully crafted question for Professor Mitchell, and we'll get to it in a moment. So yeah, just a general kind of one of the many things I loved about your talk was the incredibly handy concepts of eugentrification and neoliberalism, because they really underscore that these ideas and dreams of survival exist in a continuum, and so we can't just kind of isolate, you know, the kind of test-creel, ridiculous freaks and not take that seriously, but actually this is really deeply pervasive, even if it is on a continuum. So very helpful. And I guess my first of my many questions is thinking about the wonderful ways in which you brought together disability justice and abolition. And I was thinking with Jasbir Puar, who you briefly brought in terms of her analysis of debilitation in the context of Palestine. And this is, you know, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this in is thinking with the concept of samud as which is an umbrella meaning many things, but might translate as steadfastness, survival, refusal, and this is a term that, for instance, Lena Miari talks about in such a wonderful way, as an umbrella, as I said, which names refusal and a revolutionary mode of existing on land that has been deemed uninhabitable, particularly thinking about the Palestinian context. And this is a term that was popularized by the PLO in the face of the mass interrogation and detention and torture of Palestinians. And so one of the main kind of sources in terms of thinking about this concept and how it's also still operating today is what it means to survive, where that may entail more than just physical survival, in the context of interrogation, maiming, torture, etc. Okay, so this is one of many, many, many examples which makes the links between abolition and disability justice clear. And my question, and we can think about, the role of borders, of carceral facilities, and so on. So given these deep links, one question I have for you is whether we should understand abolition and disability justice as two faces of the same project, or two sides of the same project. Like, are abolition and disability justice distinct projects? Is there a danger in keeping them distinct? And is there a danger in kind of unifying them in some way and seeing them as two sides of the same project? And I think these questions, are very much genuine ones, and also have implications, I think, for your crash framework, which you so helpfully develop. And so there's concerns about how do you retain the kind of multi-scalar specificity in the kind of long durational systemic analysis that I think we need and you give. How do we kind of keep that specificity, and also thinking about how to strategize and resist and maintain a kind of commitment to a pluriversality? How do we do that without perhaps kind of collapsing or losing some of the distinctions and specificity we need? So, thanks.
So, it's gone off again. Is that on? No? It only wants one of us to talk at once, I guess. So, yeah. So, as some of you may know, Romy is known for easy softball questions. So, we'll start there. Thank you for those thoughts. I think they're incredibly helpful. In terms of whether abolition and DJ are separate projects, I mean, historically, social, a lot of the people who are involved in one of these movements are involved in the others. Another thing, and we were talking about this a little bit before, a lot of what might count as abolition work is actually disability justice work. I was talking about Sami Schalk's book, Black Disability Politics, which takes on the frequently, made but incorrect assumption that Black radical politics does not engage with disability. And she goes back and she says, hang on, look at all of these different actions that were taken by Black Panthers, by women's movements around Black women's health that were all about disability, but just didn't use that word, right? And that's kind of what Puar's work is getting at as well, or at least aspects of it, is that we don't have to use the state's formations to talk about vulnerabilities, violence, or positive things like identity, community, and shared history. And this is one of the aspects of my work, but also my kind of community-based contributions, as they were, is to really try to get people to think about disability communities as communities with histories and with futures, right? And I think that's part of certainly the disability justice framework. Now, so I think, abolition framework has often been led by disabled people. We look at Harriet Tubman, for instance. I mean, there's many examples throughout the years. Currently, as I say, a lot of these folks are literally the same people, or they're cross-pollinating, they're organizing, they're sharing resources. So maybe functionally, if we want to use that kind of language, they probably aren't really that separate. I do think there's a danger of aligning them completely in this moment. I actually look forward to a near future in which there's no need to keep them separate. But I think at the moment, and again, this is based on readings of the, kind of not only the literature, but also what's going on in community conversations, that not all, and again, I should mention disability justice is a very specific part of the whole kind of disability picture. Not all disabled people are into disability justice, right? And I don't want to suggest that. Most people who are identify with disability justice are pretty into abolition too, right? So I think but if you talk to people who are interested in disability rights or do, say, traditional disability studies, I mean, some of them are pretty actively invested in eugenics and in maintaining the existing medical order, right? So the medical pathological order. So anyway, right now, I think there's a need to emphasize the importance of carcerality in producing disability, in maintaining disability, but also in doing things such as using it in those extractive ways that Puar talks about, using it as oppression, using it for social stratification, right? So I think there's a need for a lot of people who are involved or care about abolitionist goals to really think about centering disability and all of those things within there, and in particular ableism, right? Bodily difference. At the same time, I think there's a lot of need for folks across the whole range of people who are disabled or who think about disability to consider the particular circumstances of carcerality and how that's involved. So in this moment, yeah, I think we do need to keep a light distinction. In my own work, I'll be honest, I mostly keep that distinction to make it legible to funders. Whatever. Functionally, it's not very useful. Okay, so in terms of how to scale without losing specificity, I think that, I mean, I don't have any perfect answers to this question, but I think that for me, this has a lot to do with scale not necessarily meaning abstraction, right? And not necessarily being additive, like, oh, okay, we've got people from 5 countries now. So again, going back to that project that Emile had mentioned in the introduction, a big part of that was about creating or helping to facilitate connections between communities who were facing these apocalyptic ongoing threats to their collective survival, but who didn't necessarily need to make it global, right? We did have to do that for the funders, but for them, it was more about these connections between what in, Eurocentric thought we might think of as communities. But for them, these are whole worlds, right? Within other knowledge systems, there's not this, very stratified notion of what a scale is, right? So for instance, one project we did, it was about indigenous space law, right? And how that might disrupt space colonizers and their plans. And the Yolngu folks that I work with, these are indigenous folks in the northern part of what's currently called Australia. And for them, they were talking about their notion of sky country, which, and country being a word for the basically everything, the land, the beings that are part of it, the people, and their duties of care towards it. Anyway, so for them, sky country is part of country, and country is a specific area, but it's also a universe, right? So I don't have a ton of really good, clear answers on how to preserve specificity, but I do think that other people might. Right?
Yeah, no, very analysis of our understanding of what scale is and what something, how to conceive of something at scale for it to be meaningful is maybe part of what we need to interrogate. So, yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I'll just ask one more question since time is ticking. It was around thinking about abolition as a project of care and survival and repair, but also as a freedom project, and both historically and presently, and also thinking still with Samud and Palestine, I'm curious, in terms of especially where you end your talk and then in your amazing book with your beautiful concept of revenant ecologies, there's maybe one question I had was around, do we need to balance more revolutionary forms of struggle? Big question, obviously, what that means, with kind of often stealthy and opaque practices and worldings of survival that are rooted in community and care. So these may not be antithetical, but this was one question I had for you, and has also come up for me in terms of, thinking about the context of renewed and naked bids for perpetual interplanetary dominance and annihilatory wars, new forms of control. How do we avoid a kind of political and ethical quietism, which would kind of suggest we just need to, wait it out if we can. And I'm thinking also, for instance, of Carl White's discussion of the concept of regime hospicing. And I think Douglas said yesterday, he feels like a death doula in some ways, and it seems quite similar. So Carl White is drawing on another article where they talk about concept of regime hospicing, in which would entail, and this is him, sitting with a system in decline, learning from its history, offering palliative care, seeing oneself in that which is dying, and attending to the integrity of the process, dealing with tantrums, incontinence, anger, and hopelessness, cleaning up and clearing the space for something new, end quote. Okay, so this seems really valuable and important approach to, rather than trying to survive in a particular way, that is, depending on how we're positioned, right, about trying to kind of predict, dominate, and be at the center of a particular future, and also as a kind of helpful alternative to exhausting oppositional ideas of what resistance might mean. But it also, and again, this is a real question, whether this sense of kind of regime hospicing and also thinking and inviting you, if you want to talk about your lovely concept of revenant ecologies, whether we might need to do a little bit more than kind of sit with the dying regime patiently and clear up after it. So.
Cool. Thank you so much for those questions. So it's interesting when you mention the a really key part of abolition is liberation. I kind of forgot an important aspect there. Right? And the billionaires and the neoliberalists, they have a pretty clear idea of what freedom looks like to them. It's sort of more of what they've got now, or better versions of it. I think that liberation is absolutely core to all of the different kind of practices I discussed at the end, but is also doesn't come with the kind of perfectionism or that level of elegant abstraction that neoliberal notions have, and that particularly these kind of imaginative transhumanist, what they think of as utopias, right? So but I think the idea of liberation, where where I was mentioning that the bunker builders are trying to make they see the planet as a prison, right? And their idea of liberation is to leave, or whether by remaining in the planet or going under the sea or into space or whatever. I think the form of liberation for many people is actually to stay, to be able to stay, to find different ways to stay, right? And that, I think, speaks to some of your. And this is actually something that is a really big point of conversation within not just academic, but within the sort of day-to-day disability community. A lot of people don't want to leave when it comes to things like the hurricanes that a lot of folks in the US have been experiencing, the fires here in Canada and Australia, and other, the flooding that Amitav Ghosh is going to speak about probably a bit later. A lot of disabled people don't want to leave because that's where they have their support systems. That's where they know how to get around. And it doesn't just come down to that. That might also be where they feel connected. This is the same for a lot of Indigenous folks who say, well, I don't just get another country. It's not just like only white Europeans think, oh, I can just have another country if I mess this one up, right? So, I mean, that idea of liberation as staying, right, is something. Liberation is, we tend to think of liberation as mobility. But if you look at, again, the bunker builders, they're saying, well, our liberation depends on our kind of, restricted mobility and everyone else's restricted mobility, right? But at the same time, that the liberation as being able to have choices about whether to stay or to go, and indeed whether to live or to die. And it was interesting when Douglas mentioned death dueling, because this is actually a really kind of, at the moment, very powerful movement within a lot of disability justice and healing justice, community-based work. If you're interested in this, there's a wonderful book by Kara Page and Erica Woodland, I think, and it's called Healing Justice Lineages. And it talks about death dueling and birth dueling, and I want like a middle-age dueling, but anyway, I'm having trouble with that one. But yeah, so it's talking about these practices as being, a really important part. It's not giving up. It's thinking, how do we die well in these circumstances, right? And not just in that kind of like, oh, poetic, like fluffy shirt, let's lie back in the moss and die happily kind of thing, right? But how do we make our deaths meaningful to whoever's coming next and whoever came before? But also, and this is something that I want to kind of put out there that I think is becoming more accepted now. There's nothing wrong with a good death, with a comfortable death, right? A lot of people are like, oh, good death. This is the whole kind of militaristic narrative of good death is to go and die on the battlefield with your guts spilling out, right? And yeah, exactly. But there's also these movements, I think, also within Black feminist politics around the politics of rest, the revolutionary nature of rest. People like, what is her name? The Nap Ministry. Do you know who I'm speaking about?
Yeah, I mean, I know that I can't remember
the other. Anyway, this is power naps, but napping, resting, sleeping as an important part of revolutionary action, particularly for Black people who have been systematically denied rest, right? And many others. Comfort for disabled people is a pretty radical idea, right? And this kind of leads me to your next question. Is there a danger of quietude? And I know you were saying there's not necessarily a sharp dichotomy, and I agree, because I think that in many ways, resting, sometimes dying, sometimes struggling, all of these things together are part of what it means to kind of be with the planet in this moment, right? And again, going back to that idea of liberation as being with the planet. So that's what I would say. And the other thing is, anyone out there who's ever done or attempted, as I'll say, I've attempted, not done, this kind of community-based organizing will know that it's not warm and fuzzy. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of lateral violence. There's a lot of things always fall apart. That's the one thing I'm always saying to people who are joining or just starting up with this kind of work, is that it's going to fall apart, and that's okay. Not everything has to last forever, including humanity. Maybe that's a good place to leave that.
Absolutely. I'll take a cue if I know you and I've forgotten your name. Sorry about that. Please just remind us all. So, yes, okay.
Oh, yeah. I think just because it's come up several times, this death doula thing that was mentioned last night, and then just we've been talking about right now. A question that keeps coming up is, so similar to the Red Scare era, where aliens and and it's still kind of present, right? Is a projection for fear of communism, fear of sociality, fear of the threats to individualism. But isn't it the case that now that I think there's people commenting on this, that it's not just the right wing that hears critique of white supremacy culture as and women in desiring to end it as saying, you're looking to end me. Mm-hmm. And I hear this in within left spaces too. There's a lack of an understanding that white supremacy is an invented construct. Yeah. And returning to some more anthropological understanding of culture in a multicultural consciousness of, I'm not white, I'm Scottish, I'm Albanian, or whatever, or mixture, and I have a multiplicity of European backgrounds, and there's indigeneity within that if you go back far enough. So like this reclaiming is often sidelined, and there's a lot of energy wrapped up in this notion that, like, what's ending? I guess maybe is the question. Like, can we be more clear about what is ending? Is it humanity, or is it that white supremacy culture is so powerful that when it's threatened, it sees that as saying humanity is ending?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a hard one to answer other than just agreeing with your final statement there that I do think that is the fear. I do think that within white supremacy there is this elision of human, I mean, this isn't my thinking by any stretch. This is classic abolitionist thought, anti-oppressive thought. This idea that, but I do think, and this is where it gets interesting when we're talking about people who wouldn't necessarily identify with the extreme right or the extreme left or anywhere sort of within some kind of clearly defined politics, because we have become so cultured to this notion of humanity, and it's really subtle. Oh, and I didn't talk about revenant ecology. Sorry.
There was like 5 different questions.
Yeah, no, it's okay. But if anybody wants to talk about that book, I'm very happy to do so. But yeah,
I'm obsessed. Sorry, I've just read it. So.
Thank you. And part of that as well was getting at this question, this book, getting at this question of what is there after this notion of humanity, right? And so this whole notion of revenants, this is something that in the book I kind of see resonating across many different strands of indigenous thought, but also I would argue many marginalized groups who are constantly asked, why don't you just not exist, right? Or forced to not exist, or expected to just kind of, fade away, as it were. So this whole notion of revenants is that, things don't always go away forever. Things come back. Their time is not particularly linear. So it draws in particular in this one Anishinaabe story about the Deer clan, who are essentially, they go away, they disappear, and the people are like, what did we do? And they realize after, I'm really paraphrasing this badly, but after long negotiations with this clan, they find out that actually the people had not been respecting the deer. Okay, so the deer withdrew themselves, but they came back. They would only stay, though, if the people continued and consistently upheld this this treaty, this social legal form of order. Anyway, so the argument in the book is that basically we're now seeing third and fourth and fifth parties. I keep hitting my nose with this thing. Breaking these relationships between, say, the people and the deer, or the people and many, many different peoples in many of these different worlds and self-contained universes, right? So anyway, where was I going with that? Yeah, so part of the question of what happens after the end of white supremacy, well, maybe revenants, right? And revenants isn't a promise, it isn't a guarantee, but it shows us that in many other knowledge systems. See, one of the things when we're talking about death dueling, back when I used to work in violence studies and war, I used to be the war and genocide person, which got a bit depressing over time. But anyway, I wrote this book about secularity and its relationship to death. And one of the key things that stuck with me from that is that Western secular societies are just not good at dealing with death. Now, one of my big arguments in revenant ecologies is that actually death, extinction isn't just death writ large. It's a completely qualitatively different thing. But how we deal with death and how we deal with endings of whether that's identities, whether that is a sense of self, just isn't well developed within Eurocentric societies, right? And that's part of where, you were talking about Kyle's work. Also, my friend Vanessa Andriotti does wonderful work on this too, if you're interested in hospicing and that concept. But yeah, so are they really afraid? And when people are saying, like you say, oh, I'm not white, I'm this or that, I'm this ethnicity, I think in some ways they're trying to cling on to some element of whiteness that could potentially survive what is being proposed as the end of whiteness, right? So I don't see those as particularly liberatory discourses or, and the whole we're indigenous, well, okay, but indigeneity in the context that it's being used means something very specific, and it means and it relates specifically to settler colonialism and imperialism. So I think there's, again, I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but what is it that's going to end? I mean, if if we understand white supremacy and other supremacies, neurosupremacy, for instance, as ordering structures, as you know, as the air we breathe, as the food that we're eating, then I think that's what's going to end. That's what it's hoped that these liberatory practices will end, is that notion that we have no other choice, no other framework, that we can't actually conceptualize humanity without thinking about white supremacists, but also ableist, also heteronormative, all these other kinds of norms. So if you want to, you know, think about how this impacts you in your daily life, take a look at the UN's SDGs, okay? Take a look at who the human is in these. The human, and I'm not going to be too literal here. I love my autistic literalism in some ways, but yeah, the humans are white. Okay, they're literally white. But if you look at them, they are, you know, normative, traditionally shaped males and females. There's only two genders. They are people who want to live a good liberal life of consumption. They're people whose needs are conceptualized in terms of that good liberal life of consumption. So in a sense, that's what's going to end. Not people's needs getting met, but the idea that there is only this humanity. Will humanity itself, Homo sapiens, end? I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic about that, to be honest. But that conception that that's it for us, I think that's what will end.
So we have 7 minutes left of our session. Oh my God! So yeah, if people want
Somebody save me, or Romy will ask another question. No, I'm joking. I love your questions.
I've got many more.
But we can
No,
also.
no, let's please. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. That was really moving. I was interested when you were talking in your original talk about the idea of not being okay with your lineage not continuing, or okay with your not surviving in a way. And I think that what we've just been talking about with death dueling and with the ideas about rest and hospice care and things like that have sort of nuanced that idea for me a bit. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you meant by that, because there was something that I was feeling in the moment where a lot of what I think about is moral growth in life has to do with deeply wanting life to go on for people that one cares about and one loves, and oneself too, in the sense that like the preciousness of life becomes a part of something that has no limit to it, that it grows. And when you're caring for someone who's dying, for example, or when you're caring for someone who is severely disabled or something, you learn so much about what it means to be empathetic toward other forms of life and things like that that are very necessary for these kinds of philosophies to reflect on, as opposed to like utilitarian philosophies like that limit the notion of moral vision.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So I think that my original notion of what you were meaning was much more complexified by the talk that you were talking about with rest and death and things like that. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how that works for you, the idea of accepting, finality in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really, really value that question. I mean, me personally, I am not good with accepting finality. I'm horrified of my own death. But I'm working on it. That question, I think, does require a little more nuancing, especially, okay, I'll say one thing. When we're talking about lineages being ended violently through this kind of annihilatory wars that Romy mentioned, through the kinds of eliminatory practices or eliminative practices I mentioned before, that is not okay, right? I mean, that is not something I will personally ever be able to make peace with, personally, philosophically, ethically, whatever. And so I do understand and deeply empathize with the desire for continuity of, so in the book Revenant Ecologies, I talk about it as a life form, right? But I think that's the distinction, and I think you got at this when you said empathy towards other beings. Okay, so, and it's funny because the utilitarians, the people are always saying, oh, autistic people, you have no empathy. I'm like, have you met a utilitarian? Anyway, so basically, and In Revenant Ecologies, I end on this idea of unconditional love as a political principle. And for me, unconditional love is deeply wanting the existence of the other. That other could be close to you, they could be distant, they could be very different from you, they could be the same, without requiring their transformation to fit within your norms. And we were talking about this in another workshop where it doesn't have to last forever. It's not necessarily a temporal concept. It's an ethics of encounter, of wanting that other to be. Now, for me, a politics of wanting lineages and histories to continue. And even, within my own life, I'm a member of a community that is being targeted by a multi-billion-dollar campaign to identify and eradicate us genetically. I want autistic people in the future, right? I want people never talk. I'm just going to go on a little tangent here. People talk about eliminating Down syndrome. No, just no. There is absolutely no reason. None of these so-called conditions that are pathologized within the medical pathological framework, these are not conditions that lead to harm and suffering. These are not conditions that kill people. These are ways of being that are disliked by the rest of this society because of ableism, okay? And most of the reason that autistic people, that people with Down syndrome get murdered, it's usually by family members, and it's usually because people find us annoying. Okay, so I want us to sit with annoyance, because that's why a lot of lineages get wiped out. Now, I'm winding back to your question here. Recently, I was reading horrifying news about 90 families that have been completely wiped out in Gaza. Okay, now, to want those families to continue, to me, that it's pretty horrific. I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing the horror in that. But what I would say is, in terms of wanting one's own genetics to carry on, one's own individualized and understood in this capitalist and eugenicist perspective as, I have the good genes, I want to carry them on, I want to stop the bad ones from putting their genes into the future. I think that's what this is against. In terms of accepting, and again, this goes back to your question about what's ending. Right? I'm not saying we should just sit back and accept the ending of Homo sapiens or anything we might have been or might become. I'm saying we should release this notion that our life form is reduced to or can be understood in terms of nuclear families or particular lineages. Yeah, we might cling to those. They might be really good sources of empathy, but we should also consider how non-human members of our ecosystems, how non-normative people that we're connected to, how all of these things are part of our life forms. We should be working for our life forms to continue in some form without being particularly prescriptive about exactly what that looks like, and certainly not trying to control it. So that's how I get at that. But again, did that answer your question? Okay.